How's it going, American History 2 students? This is Mr. Bell coming back at you with another YouTube video lesson. Let's go ahead and get started. We got two more left on our Black History Month 2020 African American History Person of the Day, and tried to think outside the box with these, talking about, comic stuff, talking about movies, professional wrestling. Of course, we had some actors, some politicians, some directors, some writers. So this was originally planned for February, Black History Month, but my son was born, so we ended up having to cut this short, and I wanted to take the time to make sure we went through it. Starting with today, our lesson with Dexter Vines, widely considered the best inker in comics. Those of you that don't know what an inker is, some people in some ways call them tracers, but that is kind of a derogatory term to describe an inker in the comics industry, because they ink everything that the artist, draws out, but it really gives differentiation between different parts. It adds some, again, I'm not an artistic person, but it adds some kind of dimension to the characters and the scenery. So I actually met Dexter Vines at a convention, really, really good guy. Met him at Heroes Con one year. So what has he inked? Superman, Batman, Justice League, Wolverine, Cap. He's from Atlanta. Here's the thing that he kind of really broke out and became the best inker in comics was Civil War, the comic, not the movie. The movie was loosely based on the comic. The comic's a little different, so that really broke Dexter Vines in. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the lesson itself. We didn't have one yesterday as far as a video. I gave you today to catch up on reading activity and videos because we had a lengthy meeting in the morning, just kind of about how we're going to approach things the remainder of the school year. Pretty much everything staying the same for you guys. Just keep working hard and do what you can. It's better to do some work than no work at all. I'm taking late work. I'm being very flexible here, so I ask you to please put in effort during this time period. So today is 153 of 180 of the regular school year as COVID-19 shutdown day 26. This is your lesson for Thursday, April 30th, 2020. Explain island hopping, and this stuff comes from 5.4, which is Unit 5, Part 1, American History 2. Island hopping. This was sometimes called leapfrogging, which is the answer to number 2. It's a plan of Douglas MacArthur. He's the overall commander of the Allied forces in World War II in the Pacific, and it is defined by conquering one island at a time rather than an all-out invasion of the Japanese islands, which would have been a suicide by the Allied forces. Also, it focused on capturing strategic islands first. For example, capturing Iwo Jima gave them air superiority in the region when they rebuilt those airstrips and were able to launch attacks from the island of Iwo Jima in addition to their aircraft carriers. So island hopping, conquering one island at a time, a nickname for its leapfrogging. Korematsu versus the USA said it was okay for President Franklin Roosevelt to put Japanese people in internment camps during World War II. They were provided food, they were provided water, they were crammed into barrack-style living against their will. Is it concentration camps? No, definitely not. But at the same time, it was wrong that we did this. But the president's powers are expanded during wartime. If you remember back to Schneck versus the USA, and that created a lot of problems for Japanese Americans and Asian Americans in general post Pearl Harbor. Okay, so the first one, conquer one island at a time. The second one, leapfrogging. Korematsu versus the USA said Japanese internment camps were legal. So we are going to finish up Unit 5, Part 1, World War II, and we'll move on to the Cold War next week. I'm going to give you an extra credit, don't have to do it, reading activity for tomorrow on the atomic bomb, but we'll get there. Okay, the impact of World War II at home, kind of jump around here, some more fun stuff involving World War II. This is always one of my favorite sections. Okay, so people really, really pitched in at home to help America and the Allied forces win World War II. Some of this you've kind of heard of before in World War I. War bonds. People would buy bonds for a couple $100. If the U.S. and the Allies won the war, they'd get their money back plus interest. It was a big source of funds for the Army, the military, during World War II. Victory Gardens people would voluntarily grow crops for the troops and made sure that they had the produce that they need, or when produce was being sent from home, that people at home would not be lacking produce, fruits, vegetables, things of that nature. Mobilizing industry. People stepped up. So you had companies who maybe made cars, like Ford, who instead of making cars, they made supplies for the war. You're seeing this right now with COVID-19. GM's making the respirators that are being used to treat COVID-19 patients. That's one thing this era has in common with the World War II era. And a lot of these men who were working in these factories were off to fight. So what that meant was it was a lot of women doing jobs they weren't previously doing during this time period of American history. So the industry, the economy, the American ingenuity really stepped up to help us win this war. Think of things like the Higgins boat that made the D-Day landing possible. Did we have propaganda? Yes, but ours was more veiled. It was more discreet. Some piece of propaganda you're very familiar with was Captain America. Now, he was co-created by Stan Lee, but a guy named Joe Simon helped create Cap, and he is going to predate all of the other Marvel characters. This is back when it was Timely Comics pre-Marvel. You see the iconic image of Cap #1 punching Hitler in the face. Superman. So Superman was born during World War II. The comic itself, Action Comics #1. Superman became very popular, being the first superhero. There was a radio play. There would be cartoons that were shown in theaters, and it would be Superman. There's always one I show. I hate that we can't do this. You can look it up on YouTube. There would be one of Superman kind of thwarting an attack on the an attack from the Japanese on the U.S. So things like this were targeted to young and old. And this is how superheroes were really first used in mainstream media. Women in the war. This is all a famous, iconic image. It's the cover photo for this YouTube video. Rosie the Riveter. She isn't a real lady, but she is based on a real lady. This is the woman who is the inspiration for Rosie the Riveter. She is drawn in this original Rosie the Riveter painting by legendary American artist Norman Rockwell. Then this image you see here becomes this. So you see there is an alteration between the two. So this is used as a source of inspiration for women to step up when they're needed the most, to do jobs that they previously only incorrectly thought only men could do. So they really step up here and put a lot of work into helping America win World War II. They're making ammunitions. They're making war supplies that are necessary. So women really play a large role here. Let's move on past Rosie the Riveter. Definitely probably the most iconic piece of propaganda from World War II from our side. So what happens here? These are things that, here's one of the lectures of this COVID stuff. And I use that lightly. Some of these things are like, this is important, but really only important for the test. Since there's going to be no state test this year, we can kind of hit the high notes and move on to some of the more, I think, historically important stuff. The Great Migration is when African Americans moved north to work in the factories. This causes some racial unrest. This was not as big of a deal as the original mobilization of World War I, because African Americans fought at a much higher percentage for the Allied forces in World War II than they did World War I. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But there were many African Americans in the South who moved north, who were not in the military, and worked alongside women and other immigrants in the factories. And when white people came back and they were fired, because of their race and racism, it did cause some racial unrest. A guy named Philip Randolph took up this cause, and he marched on Washington pre-Dr. Martin Luther King, and he pushed for worker protections for African American workers in factories. He's also one of the most famous socialists, probably besides Eugene Debs or Bernie Sanders. Socialism has had a hard time really resonating today, that kind of kept him from breaking through, whereas MLK never described himself as a socialist, meaning he wanted the government to control many or most aspects of people's lives. Here's 2 executive orders that were written during World War II. One was issued by FDR, Executive Order 8802. Remember, this is the president writing the law. They're convenient, but what that means is that what could potentially happen is that law could be quickly overturned by the next president. That's not the case here, but it is subject to going away if the next president disagrees with that policy. Executive Order 8802 bans racism in the defense industry. In other words, it was illegal to discriminate against people based on race if they were in the military or working to provide military gear during World War II. Does this mean this rule is always followed? Absolutely not. Now, this is the more important one. This is Truman, Executive Order 9981. He desegregated the military because, as a response to the Tuskegee Airmen. A great movie is called Red Tails, directed by George Lucas, the director of the original Star Wars, of course, the guy that created Star Wars. And I highly recommend that. So that's Red Tails. Check that out. I usually try to show that one in class if we have time. Now, the Tuskegee Airmen were not necessarily fighter pilots. Instead, they were escort pilots. Now, they did see a lot of hot action during World War II, but what they were tasked with doing is when there was precious cargo, they would protect that cargo, meaning they would surround that plane that was transporting items that were necessary for the Allied cause. They never lost a plane they escorted. They had a 100% success rate. Now, many of them died in the process, but as far as accomplishing their mission, getting supplies from point A to point B, they never lost anything. So this leads to Truman putting intense faith in African Americans in the United States military. He desegregates it. There's no more black and white units or regiments in the U.S. military. Instead, black and white people fight along together in the U.S. military from that point forward. So that's the Tuskegee Airmen. Hispanics during World War II, there was the Bracero program. Mexicans came to America for farm work. This happens when a lot of African Americans go north to work in factories, when white people are drafted or volunteer for the Allied forces out of factories during World War II. This is all part of that Great Migration. The zoot suit riots, this was a protest when they banned zoot suits. Now, zoot suits are these fancy suits that were made of silk, and there were certain items that they banned from production during World War II to focus on essential items. Think about Amazon right now shipping stuff like medicine before they're shipping something like a comic book, because that's essential. That's happened right now during COVID-19. The zoot suit riots is when a lot of mills quit producing these silk suits that were very fashionable within the Hispanic community, and Hispanic people and other people took to the streets and they protested. Not the most important thing maybe, but it still happened. There were many conferences during World War II in which you had the big three of Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, Churchill, the leader of Great Britain, Chamberlain before him, but mainly Churchill, and Roosevelt met to discuss big things during World War II. Of course, Roosevelt leaves when he passes away from polio, and Truman has to step in these conferences. So when I say post-war conferences, these were trying to figure out what's the world going to be like, in particular in Europe post-World War II. So there was the Casablanca conference in Morocco. They planned the Italian campaign to oust Mussolini. There was the Cairo Conference in Egypt. Japan was stripped of Korea. Korea gains independence. That leads to the Korean War between North and South Korea. We'll talk about that in the Unit 5 Part 2. Tehran. This is when the big three agree. And these happened also during World War II. So this title, Post-War Conferences, is kind of misleading, although the biggest one is post-war. Tehran. Which is in Iran. It's the capital of Iran. They meet, and they're meeting kind of at neutral places. They're not meeting in Russia. They're not meeting in the United States. They're not meeting in Great Britain. They're meeting to help plan out the D-Day operation. Potsdam, unconditional surrender of the Japanese. Truman's now president. That's after the dropping of the atomic bomb. But here's the one I want to focus on. This is the most important as far as setting up the Cold War, the Yalta Conference. Germany divided among the occupied Allied powers. So they're not going to make the mistake they did post-World War I and just leave Germany to rot. The Allies, the Soviet Union, United States, England, are going to rebuild Germany. So the question is, how are they going to do this? Well, they divide Germany up into 3 sections. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. They divide Germany up into 3 sections. And when they do this, the idea is Germany will rebuild their part. England will rebuild their part of Germany. Russia will rebuild their part of Germany. And the USA will rebuild their part of Germany. And then they'll leave. So England does their part. They leave. The US does their part. They leave. The eastern part of Germany is where Russia is occupying. They do their part. They help rebuild Germany, but yet they stay, and they refuse to give it up. And eventually this thing called the Berlin Wall goes up, and it is a game changer. It is really the thing, them refusing to give up Eastern Germany, that sparks the inevitable, I believe, Cold War between Russia and the United States. Brief pause there. So the Marshall Plan. Secretary of State for Truman, George Marshall, you remember Secretary of State handles foreign affairs, he's tasked and comes up with one of the greatest accomplishments by any U.S. Secretary of State. It becomes known as the Marshall Plan. Now, it is a plan to rebuild all of Europe that was damaged because of World War II. Give them financial aid, help them recover. And the reason for the Marshall Plan is you don't want to leave any part of Europe in bad shape and make something like socialism or communism look appealing to them, because then you're going to just end up in another world war. They made the mistake with Germany of just after World War I, just letting them pay back for their sins of World War I and just letting them suffer during the Great Depression, and that led to Hitler taking power and taking advantage of that economic and military situation over there. We want to avoid that again. The Marshall Plan is a plan to rebuild Europe. It also focuses on what was discussed at Yalta, which was the rebuilding of Germany in 3 different parts: the Russian, the American, and the Great Britain. And we talked about that, the British, and we talked about that a second ago. The last thing I want to talk about here, I know I kind of went out of order as far as World War II and right post-World War II now, is the United Nations. So the League of Nations failed, as evidenced by the action of the Japanese. So they needed something to replace it that was better in order to achieve world peace. So the UN was created, and it was headquartered in New York. It's a peacekeeping organization that nearly every country in the world has an ambassador, a representative, and when there's a major conflict, they vote. The problem is, out of all the 200 plus countries in the world, only 15 really have power. There are 15 members called the Security Council. They're part of the UN General Assembly. And there are 5 permanent members: U.S., China, Russia, Great Britain, France, and there are 10 others that rotate in every 2 years. In order for the UN to do something, all 5 of the permanent members, U.S., China, Russia, England, France, had to unanimously agree, meaning they all had to agree to take action. So if, let's say, Syria, which this happened in, what year was it? 2013, gasses its own people with chemical weapons, and the U.S. is like, we need to do something about this, and England's like, we need to do something about this, and France agrees, but China and Russia block them, there's nothing they can do, which leads to the UN being ineffective in many cases. Democrats prefer the UN because they don't want America to take on the brunt of responsibilities during world conflicts, whereas when you talk about Republicans, they would rather America lead the way when it comes to these international conflicts. So that's it for our World War II stuff, Unit 5, Part 1. Come back tomorrow. We'll do a little extra credit on the atomic bomb, going back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is stuff we talked about in 5.4. And then we'll come back Monday. Section 5.6, Unit 5, Part 2 starts, talking about the Cold War, which is between Russia and the United States. Thank you. If you have any questions, email me at bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. Wash your hands. Stay safe. Have a great day.